Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. So due to some questions that were asked on the forums about how to do things like folds around the elbow, I decided this week to talk about that. So let's call this Tip of the Week elbow fold. Hopefully that is a good enough name for this. I couldn't think of a better name for how to call this, but I guess that's kind of a descriptive name. So there's, as with any other rigging technique that we can talk about in Toon Boom, there are multiple ways of achieving this. But what I'm going to show you here today is actually something that you could do in Animate, Animate Pro, or Harmony. And then I'll show you something else next week that's something that only can be done in Animate Pro and Harmony, which is something really cool. So if we look at the rig that I've done here, what I'll show you this week is how we can set up these types of folds around the elbow and how we can animate those kind of folds. And then what I'll show you next week is how you can do something like this, where, let me zoom out here, where you have something like a sleeve and you could animate the position of the sleeve up. And you see as I'm animating this, it's like showing or hiding, the sleeve there on the arm. So there's an arm layer underneath it, and then there's a sleeve layer that, if you want to push the sleeve up, if the character is pushing the sleeve up, they can actually push the sleeve up. So that's what I'll show you next week. But let's start with this week. And so what I want to show you this week is how we can set these folds up here. So I prepared some artwork for this week, and let me show you what I did. I've got an upper arm layer, and let me just zoom out of my drawing view here so you can see what I've got. I've got an upper arm layer. If you are working with the pencil lines, then when you are doing things that are going to require patches that are overlapping each other, it's sometimes easier to do that with brush lines. So I did do this with brush lines. I started out with a pencil line version of it. Sometimes when I'm doing a rig, if I know that I want to go back and modify the size of my or the thickness of my lines later, I'll do two versions of the same drawing. I'll have my brush line version that I can use for my patch, and I'll have another version of this drawing that will be a pencil line version so that I can go back later on and adjust the size of the line and recreate my patch from it very easily. And so in this case, I've got just this version that's a brush line version of this drawing, but you could have two drawings in there. And when you are doing pencil lines, it helps to have the actual pencil line separated from the fill. And in which case, if you're using Animate Pro or Harmony, or if you're using advanced mode on Animate, you can separate using these sublayers. In your drawings, you have the ability to draw on these sublayers the overlay, line art, color art, and underlay. And these are useful just to separate things out on the same drawing layer. And keep in mind that when you animate a drawing layer, it animates all of these sublayers together. But if I want to do something where I want to separate part of it out, and I'll show you this for next week's session, this will be important for when we are talking about this arm down here. When you want to be able to separate things out, you can separate the line art and the color art out on their own when you're using this networking stuff. So we'll talk about that more next week, and I'll go into more detail with that. But just to show you on the artwork, you can separate this onto line art and color art. In this case, I did it all on the line art for this upper arm layer, and that's totally fine. So I prepared an upper arm layer, and then I also prepared a lower arm layer. And in my lower arm layer, by the way, on both of these layers here, I used that circle joint technique that I showed in an earlier drawing. Because I knew that I was going to do this weird sleeve thing next week, what I did was I did the upper arm with the full color of the sleeve, and I did the lower arm with the full color of the arm, because I knew I only wanted to be able to push the sleeve up to the elbow. But you can think about ways of doing this depending on what you need for your shot or what you need for your show. So if I have the sleeve as a full-length sleeve always, then I'll just draw it as a full-length sleeve. I'll just draw it directly on here. The only reason I did this ability here to animate this is because I wanted to just show you something extra. But if you don't need to do something extra, if you're just always going to leave that sleeve where it is, which is the case in, I'd say, 90% of the scenarios out there, then you can just draw where the sleeve ends directly on there. And when you're drawing something like a sleeve, you always want to draw one version that's facing down. So that's what you would see if the camera is looking down on the arm. And then you'd want to have one version that's facing up for when the arm is faced towards the camera. And I'll talk about that one also a little bit more next week when I talk about this drawing layer here, because I'll do both versions. But to finish up describing what I did to prepare the artwork, so I did this circle joint technique that I did go over on an earlier tip of the week. If you missed that one, you can go back there. But I did the circle joint technique. Let me just move this drawing over. So I did the circle technique with a drawing layer that has, oops, and sorry, I had put my pivot on my peg layer there. So I did the circle joint technique, and I have the lower arm layer just as the entire skin color, and the upper arm layer as the entire shirt color. But when you're doing this, if you're going to do it, you could draw the sleeve directly on here, as I mentioned. So it's up to you whether you want to follow along with the complex rig that I'm doing. So if you are following on with the complex rig that I'm doing, you can prepare the lower arm just with the skin color, and then you can prepare the upper arm just with the sleeve color, and then next week you can follow along when I show you how to add this extra sleeve bit on top there. But for this week, the other pieces of artwork that I prepared was I prepared 4 of these kind of half little fold things, which is what the elbow fold is all about. And when we look at this artwork, I did separate this out into line art and color art just because I'm using a pencil line here. And when you use a pencil line, you do want the fill to go underneath. But you don't really have to do it on separated line art and color art. It was just my preference to do it that way for this particular example. So I've got here 4 folds, and I put the folds on each side of the wrist. And then when we look at how we're going to rig this thing, what we want to do, for those of you who are working in Animate, you can just do your rig as a direct parent-child relationship by dragging the drawing layers on top of each other in your timeline. The same way that you would with any other Animate thing. So you can just drag the layers on top of each other. In this case, I'm working with peg layers. If you are working with peg layers, then you can do that. But if you're in Animate and you're not working with peg layers, you can just drag and drop those directly on top of each other. And in terms of how you want the hierarchy to look on these 4 drawings, that's kind of subjective, because no matter how you animate this thing, you're going to have to do some adjustments. So let's say if I want to take this lower arm and I want to bend the lower arm, I'll show you what the rig looks like after, but let's just start by looking at how the end result works. So if I go up the parent to the parent, and I have a parent peg in this case so that I can gather together different layers. So in my parent peg, I've gathered together the lower arm layer and the sleeve here, the downward facing sleeve, and 2 of the folds. But if I animate this upwards, you know, I'm always going to have to make adjustments here. So the folds follow the arm, which kind of does something useful. But on the other hand, and I'm just going to turn on peg selection mode on my transform tool because I'm using pegs here. But okay, so if I rotate that arm upwards, I still need to make adjustments on this to make this make sense. Like, I can't just leave this looking like this. That doesn't look good. I would have to go back on each of these folds and kind of just make some small adjustments there so I can animate those looking like that, and then I can take the lower one and I can kind of make them match, so on and so forth. But those adjustments don't take me very long to do, and the end result looks pretty good. And obviously you can fiddle with these, and maybe you need an additional fold. Maybe you have a fold that appears only when the elbow is bent. Maybe you have a sharp elbow instead of a round elbow like I do here. It really, it all depends on what look you want to get out of it at the end. And we're very flexible here on what we can do, because you're defining what these drawings look like and the positioning of the drawings yourself. And I think it kind of makes sense when these things line up with each other, but they don't really have to. I mean, you could have a fold that goes like that. They're like overlapping folds. but the only thing to be aware of is you want it to make sense while it's animating. So if I go back to the position that I had it in before, because I did put a keyframe on there, let me just, I'm just undoing to get back to my default position that I had before. What's nice about this, do you see how this animates pretty well? I have that base keyframe, and then I have the keyframe where I moved everything. And you know, it does a pretty decent job on showing what I want to show there. I get the animation, I get the things lining up pretty well, and it in betweens very nicely, because as with everything else that we're doing, we're just moving the position of drawing layers. So when we're just moving things, it always works really nicely. And if you want to, as you're doing this animation, you can also take these folds and you can scale them up or scale them down. And don't forget that you can skew as well. So if you need to or want to skew drawings, that's also a trick that you can pull out of your bag of tricks. So it's useful to get these kind of lining up a little bit nicely, and then as we look at that animating out, it's going to do a nice job for us. It's going to do the trick. So let's finish up this tip of the week for this week by taking a look at how we actually rig this thing. So for those of you who are working in Animate, you'll have your upper arm layer, and then you'll drag and drop your lower arm layer to be a child of your upper arm layer, just like you always would when you're doing a rig for a character. Now, you could do what I did here, and what I did here was I also made the two inside folds a child of the lower arm layer. And the reason I did that is because I figure most of the time you kind of want those folds on the inside there to follow what that's doing. But no matter what you do, you're always going to have to make adjustments to those drawings. So it doesn't really matter whether you make the folds a child of that lower arm or not. I think that's up for you to decide on your drawing whether it makes sense for your drawing for them to be, because no matter what you do, you're going to have to do a little bit of adjustment here. But it is faster for me to adjust the position of those drawing layers like it just did than it is for me to redraw the arm on every frame. Because if I have a fold and I bend my arm, I don't just have to draw the first and the last positions, I have to draw the first, the last, and everything in between. Now you can try to do something with morphing, but the reason I tend to personally stick away from morphing most of the time is because of the fact that with the morphing rules, you kind of have to have the same number of lines, going to the same number of lines, and you know, you can get morphing to look really, really nice, but it sometimes takes a little bit of finessing. And for me, I think it's just easier to move the position of my drawing layers around. So if I can accomplish the same look by moving drawing layers without morphing, I will choose to do it without morphing. When I need to morph, I will morph. Like last week when I did the head tutorial, and in this case I've still got it open here, but this is the one that had the deform on it. But you remember, if you watched my head rig from last week, I did have a very similar result that I got out of this by morphing if you were working with Animate Pro. So when I need to whip that morphing out of the bag, I will whip it out of the bag. But to make my life easier, I'll choose to use a pencil line, and I'll choose just to use my contour editor to move the position of the points around, because I know that if I do that, it's going to morph nicely, and I won't have to do too much finessing or massaging to get my morphing to work well. So, you know, in the case of something like the elbow, this is the reason why I like to just move drawing layers around. So you can make the two inside drawing layers a child of that lower arm in Animate by just dragging them on top of it. And then you want always these two upper ones, or the two outside ones, to be a child of the upper arm. Because you don't want to leave them out entirely, because if you leave them out entirely, then they won't follow when you animate the arm. And whoops, I didn't put a, let me just throw a pivot point on there. I'm doing all the pivot points very ad hoc on this rig because I'm doing them as I go, but you know, if you still want, you always want the folds to follow with the arm. So either you make all four folds a child of the upper arm, or you can make these two a child of the upper arm and these two a child of the lower arm. And naturally, if you need to have 3 of these folds or whatever, then you can have as many of these as you need. And you might also want to have one that's kind of hidden halfway underneath there that appears when the arm bends. It's up to you. You know, you can play around with the positioning of these different drawing layers. And for those of you who are working in Animate, then you might need to also do some nudging in order to get these in the right place in your camera view. Because as soon as you drag and drop the drawing layers on top of each other to create that hierarchy, it might adjust the Z positioning. So you might have, one of these dropping behind when you need it in front. So if you need to nudge layers, you can always remember it's the Alt and down arrow to move it forward and Alt and up arrow to move it back. But when you're working in Animate Pro and Harmony, we would do something slightly different. We would go here. Now, I always like to work with peg layers, and I've discussed in some earlier videos why I like to do that. Basically, I find it easier to have peg layers so that I can keep my keyframes separate from my drawings, even though in the new versions of Harmony, you do have the ability to turn on these drag modes so that you can drag just keyframes or drag just drawings, which really opens the door a lot. But I still like to work with having peg layers, and particularly if you're in Animate Pro, you don't have these drag and drop modes yet in Animate Pro. So you probably want to, if you're working in Animate Pro, have peg layers so that you can keep things separate. So each drawing layer that I work with is going to have a peg layer to control it. And then on top of that, you can string these peg layers together to create your hierarchy. So I've got my upper arm, which is a parent of the lower arm, and the upper arm is also a parent of the elbow folds on the outside, these ones here. I also have the lower arm here, and so if I look at the lower arm, it's a child of my upper arm, and it's a parent of these two folds here, and for the sleeve that we're going to do next week, it's also a parent of the sleeve, but we'll talk about that one in more detail next week. And then in terms of the positioning in space, you want to make sure, it's pretty easy in this case, you'll follow that, you'll follow the circle joint technique to get these drawing layers overlapping properly so that the lines aren't following each other or aren't conflicting with each other. And then on top of that, so if I look at what the circle technique does on this one, let me try to get rid of some of the stuff here that's in my way to show you this, but basically I don't want to look at my lower arm sleeve yet because I'm going to talk about that one next week. Alright. But if I just look at what's going on with the lower arm and the upper arm, so I've got my lower arm, and if I remember what my circle technique does, then I want to take the color override to cut out just the so that I don't have the lines overlapping. I'll take just the skin color of the inside, and I will overlap that on top of the upper arm. So I'll take my, now in this case I've got some additional stuff happening with this lower arm and the sleeve layer there, but in terms of what's going on, and that's, where did it go? Sorry, I've got a lot of stuff going on here. But in terms of, I'll just describe it. So in terms of what I'm doing with the circle technique, I've got my upper arm that I'll have going at some point in the timeline. I want a copy of my lower arm going underneath my upper arm, and then I'm going to have a copy of the lower arm, but just the skin color going on top of everything. So that is basically what you want to do for that circle technique, and you can review that with the circle technique video. But then when it comes to the folds, you can adjust the positioning and space of the folds by just making sure that their pipes are going on top of everything. We want the folds to show on top of both the upper arm and the lower arm, so you just can drag those pipes over further to the left. So this is something that you can't do in Animate, which is why you need to do that nudging and that Z depth stuff. But in Animate Pro and Harmony, it's the first layer of the order in the camera view comes from the timeline, and then next to that, on top of that, you can adjust the pipes in your composite. So the left side will show on top, the right side will show underneath. So if when you make your hierarchy, then if it messes up the order, or doesn't give you the right order that you want in the camera view, you can adjust the position of these pipes to pop them in front of the other layers. So let's say, for example, if one of my drawing layers was behind and I didn't like the position of that drawing layer being behind, then I can simply select that drawing, and I can move the pipe over to the left to pull it in front of those other drawing layers. So that's pretty much it that I wanted to talk about for this week. So in order to get these folds and to animate the folds, you oh, it looks like I did some extra animation there. I think I added a keyframe at some point. So let me just take that keyframe out of there so that I can see what I did. I can always remove a keyframe with F7. All right, so just to summarize, in order to get this working, what I did was I have one drawing layer for the upper arm, I have a drawing layer for the lower arm, and then I have 4 drawing layers to represent the folds there. I use this circle technique on my arm for the upper arm and the lower arm so that I don't see the line on the arm. And then I have the 4 drawing layers just on top of everything. And then when I animate the position of that arm, I can animate the lower arm, and then I can animate the position of these fold layers separately. So hopefully that helped you guys to have an idea of what we would do. And then I'll go over this extra piece next week so that you can have some fun doing an extra advanced rigging tutorial with that one. So stay tuned next week, and I will talk to you soon.